Okay, I'd like to welcome you all and to welcome Rachel Adler, who's a member of the class of 1954. And Rachel is, as you're going to learn, has a very interesting post-Wellesley career, fascinating. And rather than a formal lecture, we decided that we would have a conversation, and together we put together some images, but this is an organic chat that we might flip around, and we'll see where we go over the next half hour or so, and then can have some questions. So
you go first.
I go first. So we have some slides, and here's Caracas, Venezuela. Probably a little after, little before 1966. Rachel was much more attuned to the car styles than I was. And a couple photographs on the right side of the screen of the oil boom city of Maracaibo. Rachel, how did you get from Wellesley to Maracaibo in Venezuela?
I went to graduate school for a year. I was telling the story when I was a senior here. I didn't know what I was going to do. I was terrified. The school was over, and I didn't know. So I, fortunately, Sidney Friedberg had been one of my professors. And one day he said, "What are you going to do next year?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "You want to go to graduate school?" "Sure." I mean, that was the answer. So I went. It was not for me. I went back to New York, went to work at the Guggenheim Museum. Now, when I was at Wellesley and at graduate school, art history ended with one lecture on Cézanne. That was it. The 20th century did not exist. I went to the Guggenheim Museum as assistant registrar. The museum was just organizing. Solomon Guggenheim had died, and we were opening boxes with clays and Feiningers and Brancusis, and it was just a whole other world opening up. Anyway, after that, I was around for a while. I went to the École du Louvre. I married and went to live in Venezuela because I married a Venezuelan.
Whose name was?
William Concrete Grisanti, half American and half Venezuelan of Corsican descent. Now, I have to tell you, Venezuela has always been a country of immigrants, and it's much to their good. I mean, it's what's made the country.
So how'd you go to Maracaibo? What was that like in the 60s?
He was working for the affiliate of ESSO in Venezuela and sent to Maracaibo. Maracaibo was a frontier. It was a frontier town in Spanish. I mean, there were Guajiro Indians walking around in costume and, dare I say it, shoe polish on their faces. There were engineers from all over the world. There were companies like Schlumberger, Halliburton, Fluor. These are the big oil companies. And people came, they were Portuguese, Croats, people who had been, let's see, a lot of French, a lot of British, and it was in this strange, weird place that was half incredibly primitive and half the greatest mechanical advances in the world. And these guys were sitting out on the oil wells and learning Persian poetry or all sorts of esoterica because they had time on their hands. So it was a fascinating time.
Fascinating frontier town, yeah. So we're gonna get to opening a gallery, but when you had some arty background, I mean family arty background.
Daughter of an art dealer.
And that dealer was the founder of
Herschel and Adler.
Herschel and Adler in New York, which.
But I liked the 20th century, so I was sort of an apostate around.
Talk loud, talk and tell them all
I
that.
was interested in the 20th century, so I was a little bit of an apostate around Herschel and Adler.
When you got to Venezuela, when you're in Maracaibo, you've worked at the Guggenheim. Was there any art scene in Maracaibo, or is everything happening in Caracas?
There was actually one collector in Maracaibo, but he was, of course, coming to Caracas in order to buy his art. And what happened when we moved back from Maracaibo to Caracas, I had to go to work. We needed money. So I went to work as the art critic for the Caracas Daily Journal, which was a newspaper that had been founded by some friends of Nelson Rockefeller. They had all gone down to Venezuela after school and started things like supermarket chains, chicken farming, milk, basic economy stuff, and a newspaper for the foreign colony.
And you were doing art
I went to the museum. Yes, I was their art critic. I went to the museum, and there was a campaign on. Someone had lent a portrait of Madame Cézanne to the museum, and they were trying to raise money to acquire the painting. Anyway, it ended up with Miguel Arroyo, the director of the museum, offered me a job.
As
Well, I was supposed to be the registrar because their filing system had consisted. He was a new director. You know, you open a drawer, you put the papers on top. When the drawer is full, you go to the next drawer. Total chaos. Anyway, because I was a foreigner, I could only be hired as a professor guia. No, I couldn't be hired on as an employee of the museum. But it was great. It was absolutely great.
And these are we just have pictures here of
This is what the museum looked like. Now, this is interesting. You'll notice there's a cauldron there. We should talk now a little bit about
the art. What we really want to talk about is what was
scene.
the art scene like in Caracas when you got there in the early 60s?
I got there in 1957. 1958, there was a revolution, which was a little bit difficult, shall we say. Then I came back. There were floods, there were earthquakes. But the thing about the Venezuelan art scene that I think was interesting and unique to Venezuela, first of all, there was oil. And that was the basis of everything because there was money flowing. And the way it worked is the oil went straight to the government. They owned the subsoil rights, but it was distributed. And there was higher prosperity in Venezuela at that time than I think certainly in any of the northern South American countries. And there were, coincidentally, a few people who I think set the scene for this and allowed this thing to flower.
This art world.
This art world. Venezuelans had been traditionally patrons of the arts. In the middle of the 19th century, they were sending artists to Paris. They went straight to the salons, but they were on state scholarships. And when they came back, they were being supported by state commissions. And I don't know if this was unique, but it certainly was very prevalent in Venezuela and important.
You mentioned, because we have these images on the screen, these guys. Right. Sorry. Whoops. We'll get
this.
to. Yeah.
All right. There were other people who were very important in this. This man is Carlos Raúl Villanueva, who was the architect of the university city. This was started under the dictatorship of Pérez Jiménez, but continued. By the time I got to Venezuela, it had been built. It's 50s modernist architecture, But his idea was that you had to integrate the work of artists into the architecture and into the surroundings. And this, I think, formed generations of Venezuelans. I mean, it just changed their ideas. There was work by Arp. There was Vasarely was very important. Leger was there. Pevsner.
And the auditorium
and this is the most important, the Calder. These are the acoustic panels for the auditorium. They're fantastic. The auditorium, by the way, you can see from any place in it absolutely perfectly. But Calder came to Venezuela and was there for several months. He produced an exhibition there. I don't remember how many works. I think it was 60 some odd works, all of which were sold. That made art collectors of an awful lot of people in Venezuela. At the same time, there was a woman who was the wife of the Venezuelan cultural attaché in Paris. Her name was Sofia Imber. And she was then Sofia Meneses. She was buying art and selling it. She was really pushing it down their throats of a lot of people in Venezuela. There were tons of ARPs. There were tons of air bands, of Vasarely. She was close to Denise René, who was a dealer in Paris, dealing with these people. And this formed a certain kind of culture for modernist art. And there were Schwitters there. There was
because you'd said, I mean, we had a conversation, and if I can get back to these, that this was the sort of work that a more tradition. Could you talk about the traditional collectors?
Venezuela, Caracas has an extraordinary light. It changes color all the time, and it has that mountain. And that mountain, which is the Avila, is never the same, always changing color. And it, I think, inspired a group of landscape painters who were post-impressionist painters. They were good painters, but they were painting genre paintings, and above all, these landscapes. Somehow or other, in a very changing economy and a changing society, the kind of art you like became mixed up with a political choice. And I don't know if you know this phrase, gente decente, the nice people. They liked that. The others who liked that abstract stuff, they were the communists. So we got this thing, and it was, strangely enough, it really did become an issue, whether you liked modern art or this. Now, I just sent this catalog along because this catalog explains what was going on in Venezuela. There were old money people who had been collecting classical art, old masters, and German expressionists. Some of the German families who lived there had been collecting the German expressionists. And you had this, and then you got that. And that was in the hands of someone who was a refugee who had come after the war.
Neumann, right?
Yeah, this was Hans Neumann. And this was Rodriguez Landaeta.
Yeah.
And
it doesn't really read very well, but Rachel sent me this catalog. She's actually kind of creating an archive of all the catalogs, all the dupe catalogs that she has of her shows from the 60s through even her New York.
The 70s, really.
And to have an archive here at Wellesley College that students can use of all, to just go through. And incredible. And we'll talk a little bit about that.
It's incredible that you had this
probably no other I mean, I don't know how many libraries have this, but it is an extraordinary thing. You're flipping through this little catalog of a show in not even at the Museo de Bellas Artes, and it's Picasso, you know, Morandi. I mean, the most sophisticated objects and the highest quality objects of all of these artists, including people like El Greco. And the fascinating thing for me is in the 50s and 60s in Mexico, you didn't have one. Maybe you had the Gelmans were probably the only collectors that were buying things like this, and they had most of that European art in New York, and they kept most of that in New York. So the sophistication of the Venezuelans was, you know, it's amazing.
But there's a story I must tell you. I just remembered it. When people were buying this, they loved Barbizon landscape, and Corot was the apotheosis of Barbizon landscape. And there was always a story that Corot painted 1,000 paintings, of which 2,000 were in Venezuela. We go back to the fakes. To the point that, for instance, in Venezuelan slang, your possessions, your household possessions, are known as corotos.
Are you serious?
I am serious.
How about that? Wow. Let's see where we are. So there are these two kind of, there were the European refugee immigrants.
Yeah, we also had, that's something else. We had an influx. Venezuela very smartly decided that a lot of the European Jewish refugees who couldn't get into the United States could come to Venezuela because Venezuela needed a middle class. And they were going to import a middle class. Some of them went to Colombia, then to Venezuela, to Cuba, and then to Venezuela. But this changed the whole tenor of, certainly of the collecting, because these are people who had come from families that had art and knew art. They came, they prospered, and they started buying art. The art they started to buy was the art that they had before, which was German Expressionism. And then they went on to expand and to buy Venezuelan art as well.
So in that context, how did you, when exactly did you found a gallery, an art gallery, and why?
Why? I needed money. I started out at the museum as the registrar, then became the sort of the executive secretary of the Friends of the Museum. Then I went into, they founded a global, sort of an umbrella cultural organization. And one of the vice presidents was Alejandro Otero, who never in one day went to work. Never.
The painter.
So I was there doing the work. And then I thought, you know, this is ridiculous. I'm really working hard. There's no money involved. And my father said, open a gallery. We'll help. And so I started doing post-impressionist things, impressionist things, doing German expressionist.
So
Yeah.
here's an example of an early catalog from the gallery.
This is I sold this to a German museum from Venezuela, which was sort of
Quite
interesting.
something. But a lot of these things did stay. And Rachel was telling me that, of course, there was just a lot of interest in German Expressionism because of this German collector group in this.
But with that, when I was working at the museum, Gerd Leufert was the assistant director of the museum. Gerd Leufert was Gego's partner. So they became my crowd. Cruz Diaz Soto, this is Gonzalo Fonseca. Fernando Cislo didn't paint like any of the other artists in the gallery, but he was the most charming man in the world. So he came along.
This is an array of the catalogs from this archive.
That's Alejandro Otero up there. Those are works he did at MIT.
These black and white things.
Yeah, those are maquettes. He did a large sculpture, which is at the Air Space Museum in Boston,
In Washington.
in Washington,
Yeah.
which we installed.
And Policello
This is
over here.
Policello.
So this is just to give an example of the wide range of styles of objects, and in not only selling Venezuelan contemporary art, but also from Argentina particularly.
Yeah.
And
Well, what happened is that we sort of embarked into the kinetic field, and there's something that a Dutch art critic came to Venezuela one day, and he said something that really struck me and has stayed with me. He felt that the kinetic artists, the Sotos and the Cruz Diezes, were the heirs to the landscape painters, because all of it had to do with light on an object. And there's this, as I said, there's this incredible light in Venezuela, in Caracas. And he felt that this shimmering was really sort of in the eyes of the kinetic painters. They changed the vocabulary. They changed it into an abstract, into a geometric vocabulary. But basically, it was the same thing.
so here's Cabaret with an early Soto from 1946.
Soto lived in nowhere. I mean, in the middle of a road in southern
Ciudad Bolivar.
and outside
Outside it.
which is Alejandro
Outside the
Otero
periphery.
came from the oil field, from the rubber fields, from the Balata, from Upata, from the rubber fields. Both of them. No, Alejandro told me that his only knowledge of art came from the stamps. His uncle was the postman, and he used to tear the stamps off the letters and show them to him.
So I wanted to, I told her before, I've talked to her for 2 or 3 hours at her apartment
And
in
I
New York.
talk too much.
No, you don't talk too much. What I wanted to say is, we were talking about the Soto's connection to that landscape through his own classes, but also this idea of the vibrating light there in Caracas. And we also talked then about the impact, if you could talk a little bit about Vasarely.
Vasarely, a Vasarely exhibition came around Latin America. I'm not sure when. It should have been sometime in the late 40s. But it made an enormous impression. And these guys simply got up and they left and went to Paris. And at that time, Vasarely had, with Denise René, founded her gallery. And the gallery became a sort of a magnet for these artists. Their goal to support themselves was to be able to go and paint the Vasarelys. As you know, they were done on a plan in a workshop. And they formed a school. And it was interesting because nobody knew them in Caracas. They were in Paris. Soto started, he was a member of Group Zero, and he started to have a certain success in Paris. And Carlos Raúl Villanueva said to Miguel Arroyo, "This is ridiculous. The guy is selling art in Paris. Nobody knows him in Venezuela. He's our most famous artist at this time. He's got to win the national prize." Well, how are they going to arrange that? They sent a few paintings to the museum, and they were selling them out of the museum in order just to get his name known. And then, of course, it took. And I'd like to say something about Venezuelans different from other places. Architecture, design, and painting were enormously important. And they were important in society. Who's the architect of your house? That's a big thing. Did you have this architect or the other one? Who designed the logo for your company? That was another very big thing. Because a lot of these people who had come, Gerd Leufert, Nadeau, Gego herself, they had been taught design and they brought design with them. And it was, who got the contract for the Hilton Hotel, for the logo, for the stationery? These catalogs that we put out, the catalog cover was almost more important than what was in it. Because that, for instance, every artist designed his or her own catalog. That's a Gego. Gego designed it. And it was, I think, Gego, or was it Leufert?
Leufert, I think.
Who did that. But it was just terribly important. And what kind of art did you collect? I mean, that also, along with your house, was very important. And what kind of a soto did you have? Did you have an escritura, or did you have something of lesser importance? So I can only speak for Venezuela because that's where my experience was. But I think that, it exists here now, but did it then?
Sure,
I
but
suppose.
I think it's just hilarious to think of people at a cocktail party saying, do you have an escritura or not? These would be a big, one of his big major works with floating wires hanging in front of a screen.
They are the best.
And as they are the best. You'll see downstairs in the galleries, we have a small multiple by Jesus Rafael Soto. It's this object here on the right. But although it's a multiple, for these artists, multiples were really important in getting the kinetic experience out to a wider audience than could afford the big, large major objects. So they didn't just think of the multiples as an offshoot of their practice. They thought of it as really an essential part.
I think it's the moment where conceptual art meets kinetic art, certainly this kind of art, because they say the idea is important. The manufacture, which we can't do anyway because it's industrial, doesn't matter.
Right.
And so it is the idea, and you can have the piece of art, even though there are 100 of them, the same as somebody else's unique.
And it was crucial for me to have some representation of kinetic art in the collection, since it really does not work in a photograph. And you'll all see, some of you have seen and will see. You've got to walk by it. I wanted to conclude maybe with focusing a little bit more on Gego, this woman born Gertrude Goldschmidt. She was born in Hamburg, and ends up in Venezuela also because of the war. I mean, the benefits, in quotes, but the benefits to many of these Latin American cities, Buenos Aires, but certainly Caracas and Mexico City, because of these refugees who transformed the art world, was really crucial. But Gego didn't emigrate as an artist, really. She had been trained as a...
Well, Gego came from a very wealthy family. She had studied architecture. Supposedly, she was kicked out of the university when Jews were not allowed to study in the universities. However, her teachers let her go through. And when she used to tell the story that when it came time to for the diploma, somebody said to her, look, you can't get a diploma because we've been hiding you for the last 3 years. Anyway, she eventually emigrated to England. And once she was in England, looking for a place to go because the only work she could get was domestic work. This was just at the beginning of the war, and there were a lot of refugees coming into England, and that's all they were allowed to, that's all they could do. So she went to Venezuela. She married there, had children, and Gego was a very unique person. She was more than half deaf, and she lived very much in her world. She would not put a hearing aid on because she said she heard what she wanted to hear and didn't have to hear the rest. And she She started doing a lot of work with architects because this was something else. Because of the university city, every new building going up in Caracas had to have a piece of a work of art, either as a mural or as a piece of sculpture, but there had to be something. Again, it was the importance of the building.
Rachel, one of her most famous pieces is the Reticularia that's shown on the right side, which is late 1960s wire sculpture. And this is an installation shot in the museum in Caracas. It's a little hard to see today.
We first exhibited it.
But you showed it
gallery.
first at the gallery. And this is really one of the greatest icons in the history of Latin American art. Could you tell, you were talking with me a little bit about watching her work and how this work was made. As you can all see, it's made up of metal wire that fills the space, but it's more complicated than that.
Well, she was knitting with a needle nose pliers. She used to carry these little pliers around, and it looked like knitting as she was putting this thing together. One thing that is important, reticularia is an environment. You can't pick out a piece of it and say, here's a reticularia. You have to be in it because it's something you're going to experience. And it's magic. And it's adaptable. We did it in New York at the Center for Inter-American Relations, which is now the Americas Society. And that was a marvelous experience because there were about 10 young artists who were living in New York who came to help. And all during it, there she is, knitting away and doing her thing.
But it's not how pre-planned is it?
I think a good deal of it is. I think it is.
And was it saleable? I mean, did the museum buy it, or when you showed it, or was that just?
No, I never sold it. We did this for the fun of it. I mean, you just do it.
You also said, talking about selling, you talked a little bit about how in the 60s and 70s there was a strong market for Soto, Carlos Cruz Diez, Otero, in Europe more, and in Venezuela.
Otero was more in Caracas because he didn't stay in Europe. He kept coming back to Venezuela. So the other two stuck it out, always with Denise Rene.
So, and you had a sense that there was less interest in these artists in the United States at that time?
Yeah. One gallery, Sam Coots in New York, took Soto on, eventually said, no, I can't do this because it's too difficult to store. I mean, it was Americans somehow, we wanted the color. And we were into the color fields. And the geometric art just didn't seem to go.
You have to think that maybe Soto's Fiesta of 1969 was appealing to some of those collectors that wanted Latin American art to look bright and have that resonance.
Jay, I'm still a little bit unsure. I was not selling Latin American art. I was selling Venezuelan art. I was selling kinetic art. And it was Marianne Martin who made Latin American art, made a field.
So you didn't really think of yourself as you just were a gallery in Latin America.
I was in a gallery in Latin America dedicated to a certain style of art, if you want to call it that. And luckily, when I got to Venezuela, I landed in the middle of this. I mean, I could have landed someplace else and not been as lucky as to find these artists.
Right.
And there was an environment that allowed me to do this and to do the other things which I liked very much. While I was in Venezuela, I was learning from the dealers that I was meeting here. We could get rid of that.
Well, let's finish with the slides, and then we can, because the last thing is just to maybe mention Liliana Porter, and this image here shows 2 pages from a catalog.
Actually, they were from the exhibition.
And Rachel gave us, eventually years later, this lithograph, which actually has actual wire to simulate the glasses frames, and then the glasses are projected through photo and then lithographed onto the paper. So it's a really quite extraordinary object. It's actually not on exhibit, but it is in the collection. Just a little bit about Liliana, and then I think...
At one point, you'll notice that the name of the gallery changed to Adler Castillo. That's because Jose Guillermo Castillo, who had been at the Center for Inter-American Relations and was responsible for the Latin American boom in literature, joined me as a partner. He had been a member of the New York Graphic Workshop with Liliana and Luis Kamnitzer. So Liliana came into the fold. And Liliana, I would say, is a little bit in the Gago pattern, personality-wise. She has her own world. And she's got more humor than Gago did, but it was very interesting for me, and we remain good friends to this day. Because it was another dimension to what I was doing. And I think that kinetic art moves very easily into conceptual art. And so she fit right in. And she's, you've got work here, and she's been here.
And she's coming back.
And she's coming back.
In April.
And I just urge all of you, she's a delight, and she's a very interesting artist. She thinks a great deal, and she's worth listening to.
As are you. Thank you very much.
I want to say one more thing.
Sorry.
I have one more thing to say. I want to thank Jay, because being obliged to do this has brought back some fantastic memories. You know, all of the things that you forget, or you don't forget, you don't think about. And it was good times. It really was.
Yeah.
So thank you.
You're welcome.
Really.
We're gonna do the tour, but are there there are some questions. So we're gonna take one again here. Mary. Sorry.
Rachel, when did you leave Venezuela, and what did you do? I know you moved back to...
I left Venezuela in 1979. I came back here, and I opened my gallery, mostly dealing in early 20th century art, which I had gotten involved with through the people I was meeting from Venezuela, galleries here. And I went into Russian constructivism and Bauhaus and all of the avant-garde movements, still doing some Latin American, or some Latin Americans.
Right. Liz, and then Cecilia.
Hi, Rachel. I was the director for a chunk of the 90s at the American Society, which was previously Center for Inter-American Relations. And I came there as a specialist in Mexican art. Really didn't know a lot about Latin America, but we had a fantastic library then. And those catalogs that you showed, I just want to say that was an education for me. During lunch hour, I would pull out all those catalogs. And that is how I learned about what was going on in Venezuela. That was such a gift. And the design, of course, was amazing, but what was inside?
We used to print some of your catalogs in Caracas and bring them up.
Okay. That was before my time, but I didn't know it.
Yeah, we once got involved with 3,000 catalogs in a snowstorm.
That's for the conversation part too. Cecilia, did you have a question or a comment or something?
Hundreds, it's wonderful. Can you tell us something about your experience with the Gonzalo Fonseca exhibition?
Okay. Well, Gonzalo, Cecilia knew him better than I did, I think, was a difficult person, I would say.
Yes.
He came to us through Jose Guillermo Castillo, and the work was incredible. It's all of its references to Torres Garcia and symbolism, and to see it in stone, and the writing on the stone is, and then the objects that are inserted into the sculpture, which Gonzalo always said to me, he hoped people would steal, because he wanted the sculpture to look like relics, as if they were left over from other times. And we had 2 exhibitions in Caracas. We sold them all. We did absolutely and Gonzalo, even after I left, Gonzalo kept going back. And when I saw the exhibition at the Noguchi Museum, the first thing I went with a couple of my kids, I was, oh my God, that used to be at home. It was like going, but I think Gonzalo was a very, very talented artist. I think his difficult personality probably impeded his career. I don't know what's happened afterwards, because there was a complete shutdown. But Gonzalo would came to Caracas a couple of times, stayed with us for long periods of time. And as I said, he was a difficult character.
Because he was Argentinian or Uruguayan?
Uruguayan.
Uruguayan, but he was living in New York, right? Since quite...
Well, he was married here. And when I met him, the children were in their late teens, so obviously he had been, he was married to Elizabeth Kaplan, who was a daughter of the people who owned Welch's grape juice. But her mother,
he married well.
But her mother was Alice Kaplan was a great collector.
Uh-huh.
She was a drawings collector, and she was and Gonzalo was a good-looking man. Was he not?
This is just a fragment of a conversation I've had now a few times with Rachel, and every time it goes into different directions. And of course, one memory then triggers another, and a question triggers another thing. But it's also, I think, fascinating that out of Wellesley College, and you weren't an art major at all, were you?
No, it was political science.
Political science.
Well, I was a rebel. I was supposed to be an art major, go into the gallery.
She was the rebel by not being the art history major, right? Because her father was the dealer.
In the middle, at the end of my sophomore year, I thought, why am I kidding myself? I really want to do it.
Uh-huh.
So I kept the political science major, but I still did.
Did art history.
Yeah.
Good. Well, we're all grateful for that and for you coming today.
Well,
Thanks.
it's been fun.
Thank you.